Now, for more on President Trump's state visit, let's bring in our current affairs commentator, Einar Tangen. He joins us live from Beijing. So, Einar, help us understand the importance of the trip, especially in the eyes of Chinese leaders.
Well, a lot of this is about optics, Rachelle. What they're trying to do is show that China and the U.S. can get along. This is a very tenuous point in history. We have a lot of chaos around the world. China is involved in an expansion program with its Belt and Road Initiative. The U.S. seems to be pulling back at different times. So today, the hard work starts. There will be a lot of pomp and ceremony over these signings. But the question is, what is the long-term view that Trump has beyond deal-making, and will Xi Jinping be able to convince him that a blueprint for the future is what is necessary for world stability?
So then what are some of the common goals that we can expect to see highlighted?
I think really it's going to be around these deals. I think there'll be a lot of happy talk. Yesterday was a very, very nice exchange between families, literally. But today it's the issues Wilbur Ross will be pushing on different sides, as will Rex Tillerson on the security side. The difficulty is it's good for Donald to be in Beijing right now. Things are not going so well domestically. I think this gives him a little bit of political red meat to bring back to the U.S., especially if the $250 billion number is reached.
Now, given some of the stances that we've seen Trump take on issues like climate change and globalization, what issues do you think Xi will push Trump on?
Well, I don't know that Xi Jinping will be pushing him. I think it'll be more holding the line. I think, as we have talked about numerous times, the Belt and Road Initiative is extremely important to him. Obviously, North Korea. China sees itself as a switchman. It sees two trains kind of heading at each other at fast speeds, and they're trying to figure out some way to get them on sidetracks, either through six-party talks, through a double freeze, through a two-track program, whatever they can suggest to make sure that people are talking as opposed to firing.
And to that end, we know that Wednesday was a big day when it comes to culture. How do you think that plays into the overall relationship between the two presidents?
Well, there are huge gaps, gulfs between the cultural understanding between the U.S. and China. And these are legitimate and very sincere attempts on the Chinese side. On the U.S. side, sometimes these are seen as very soft, not necessarily business related. How do you measure them? All of these things. But the person-to-person exchange and cultural identity is very, very important to an emerging China. And this is something that hopefully Trump has experienced yesterday, and he will appreciate and understand that China is a very proud culture, that they see themselves in a unique way, and that there is room for two different paths in the world, or many paths, to prosperity.
So, Einar, let's start with a look at how China views its overall trade relationship with the U.S.
Well, it's basically symbiotic. You have the two largest trading countries in the world that are not really competing. If you look at the United States competes with the European Union. The EU produces everything that we do. China is at a second tier, although it's moving fast in a lot of areas. I think China sees its future trying to leapfrog some of the legacy systems still in place in the U.S. from the big controlling entities who are trying to eke out as much profit. But I completely agree with this idea that GDP is no longer a relevant way of looking at economic development. It was a post-World War II measure when everything you produce was generally from your country. Today's global supply chain has completely upended that, and it's something that people have to start looking at. Measures are very, very important because they determine whether you're making progress.
So despite the fact that we know that by focusing on one small part of an economy that doesn't really tell the whole picture, the U.S. does continue to call for a rebalancing of the trade deficit. How realistic is that?
Well, as I said, until you get to a way of measuring this, it's not very realistic. You're talking about apples and oranges, literally, no pun intended. It's really a situation where China and the U.S. have to agree on a standard set of measures and start looking at the underlying causes. U.S. businesses have to be more competitive. They have to take their strong suits, not only to China, but the rest of the world. Remember, the jobs that went to China are now leaving China, and they're going to places like Vietnam, Myanmar, India, Bangladesh, all the places where there's even cheaper labor than the rising labor costs here in China. So regardless of how the U.S. sees China, the global economic situation is being pushed by the market, and the market is moving towards efficiency. And the U.S. we have to acknowledge that fact and figure out better strategies to deal with it.
Now, given that the Trump administration is focusing on this issue with the trade deficit, how do you think that could potentially impact the Chinese economy?
Well, it all depends whether he pushes the nuclear button and goes into a trade war. This would damage both countries and also halt the current economic growth, which is helping the world get out of the last malaise that we've had since 2008, 2009. The fact is, it looks good optically in terms of politics, but I think China sees an opportunity here to say, look, Donald, here are a large number of deals. You can go back to the U.S. and say, look, I made a great deal when I was in China, $250 billion worth of future trade. We're going to figure out a way to do this. But I'm hoping that he understands that this is about metrics, how you measure things, and that he comes to some sort of rational conclusion that in the future, China and the U.S. have to talk at the same level about the same things.
So speaking of those deals, in your opinion, what do you think are the most important trade deals signed so far this week?
Well, I think the energy is, of course, very important. It draws things together. I'm sure Alaska is delighted to be expanding their trade with China. I see these really, though, as kind of unconnected. I mean, these are dots in the stream. They create a lot of fanfare, but the question is, how do these two countries integrate globally? What does America want to do in terms of economic strategy? Xi Jinping has laid out a very expansive 30-plus years idea of where China is going, both economic, politically, and socially. We do not have that sense right now. Donald Trump is more situational, and he's looking at that. The question is, how do you mesh this long-term view with a very, very short transactional view?
Indeed. Thank you so much for your insights. Our current affairs commentator, Einar Tangen there.